World War I requires almost no introduction. It's understood to be one of the most influential conflicts in human history. Old countries fell, new countries were made, millions of people died, and it was widely considered to be the first modern war. World War I would change all warfare forever, and it would change the continent of Europe forever. Most of us already understand how deeply World War I affected Europe, but it's called a world war for a reason. It did massively affect the entire world, and specifically, it had a very big impact on the country of Iran. Despite being geographically distant from conflict in Central Europe, Iran would suffer one of the worst and most brutal atrocities throughout the entire war. Millions of Iranians starved in a mass famine, and the entire country was ravished with extreme poverty and disease. This is extremely surprising to most people, because most people probably had no idea that Iran was even involved in World War I. Most people probably wouldn't even consider it. So today I'll be talking about the Great Iranian Famine of 1914 to 1918, which is easily the most deadly famine in Middle Eastern history. It's an extremely under-discussed historical event, even among the academic community, so I'll try my best to give a proper explanation. First of all, before we get to the famine itself, it's important to give some context to the situation of Iran beforehand. After a bloody civil war, Iran went under the leadership of the Qajar dynasty in 1749, and since then, Iran entered a period of extreme instability. Iran found itself being crushed by neighboring empires, as well as suffering from internal corruption and mismanagement, especially after getting involved in very destructive wars. In the 1800s, Iran lost two very important wars to Russia, the Russo-Persian War of 1804 to 1813, and later, the Russo-Persian War of 1826 to 1828. Both of these wars were humiliating defeats for Iran. They lost really important territory in Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and other parts of northern Iran. And on top of that, the Iranian economy suffered massively. These wars were extremely expensive, and Iran was already in a bad economic position before the wars even happened. The Iranian economy had been underdeveloped for quite a while, due to economic isolation and an overdependence on agriculture. In terms of the basic economic structures, Persia depicted the key features of a backward economy: the predominance of land-related and agricultural activities in the nation's livelihood, primitive and limited road and infrastructure networks, a low degree of urbanization, despite a somewhat favorable rate compared with pre-industrial Europe, and limited although increasing internal and external trade. This left Iran in a very weak economic position with a lot of debt, leaving Iran in a very easy position to get bullied by neighboring empires. So of course Russia, who was a long rival of Iran, would take this opportunity to push even further. By the late 1800s, Russia was able to establish strong economic influence across northern Iran via financial institutions and loans that the Iranian government was forced to take. As the Shah sought to modernize Iran, maintain his lifestyle, and pay for the many disastrous wars in which he and his predecessors had engaged, both Great Britain and Russia were willing to extend him loans, often at extraordinary rates or with political conditions attached. The Shah borrowed money from Russia in both 1900 and 1902. The gold which Tsar Nicholas II provided was a small price to pay to tie Iran further into the Russian sphere of influence. This sphere of economic control would lead into subsequent decades of Russian domination, not just economically, but also militarily and politically as well. So now that I've given a basic overview of Russian Empire's relations to Iran, I'll now give a little bit of an overview of the British Empire and its relations to Iran. So, the British Empire has had a long history of meddling and getting involved in the Middle East. But particularly with Iran, they were primarily driven by security interest for British India. British imperial interest in Persia and the Qajar period were primarily determined by the concern for the security of colonial India, and secondarily by trade, telegraphic communications, and financial or other concessionary agreements. And beyond just security or trade, the British Empire was also very interested in finding petroleum in the region. The British Empire had helped the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company establish a deal with the Iranian government in 1901, allowing them a period of time to search for oil in southern Iran. So these are the fundamental reasons for British interest in Iran: to protect their Indian assets and to siphon natural resources while increasing trade. Another nation that I'll quickly mention is the Ottoman Empire. They would not be immediately involved in any of this, but they would play an important role later on. The Ottoman Empire was an historic rival of Iran and still had a lot of interest and aggression towards the region. So at this moment in time, Iran was essentially surrounded on every side by unfriendly and aggressive powers: the Russians, the British, and the Ottoman Empire. This would leave Iran being controlled by two empires, the Russians and the British. Naturally, this would lead to a contentious situation as both empires vied for more control. But neither Russia or Britain wanted outright war, so they tried to make diplomacy work. This ultimately led to the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907, in which the country of Iran was divided between both powers. The Russians gained control over northern Iran, and the British were given the southeastern region. The territory between Russian and British control was classified as neutral territory. By the Anglo-Russian Agreement of August 13, 1907, Iran was effectively partitioned into two spheres of influence, in a neutral zone. The northern part of the country was included in the Russian sphere, and the southeastern part was in the British sphere, while the remainder was declared a neutral zone. Now, this agreement was very shaky from the start. Both empires wanted much more control, so this treaty couldn't prevent conflict forever. But it did manage to include a somewhat peaceful status quo in the time being. But Iran was still in a very terrible situation, as it was essentially surrounded on every single side by aggressive imperial powers. This tenuous peace would not last, as trouble was brewing in Europe, and everything for Iran would be downhill from here. On June 28, 1914, the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist, thus causing the outbreak of World War I in Europe. Austria-Hungary and Germany both declared war on Serbia, and many other countries retaliated by declaring war on each other. The entire continent was quickly thrusted into a chaotic and deadly war. Now, because Iran was far away in the Middle East, they weren't immediately threatened by conflict in Central Europe. They were geographically isolated from the major conflict. And because the Iranian economy was in such a terrible position, they couldn't really get involved in the war even if they wanted to. It would just be way too disastrous for the economy. Even though Iran firmly wanted to stay out of the war, this conflict did pose a very interesting question regarding national liberation. At the outset of World War I, most Iranian nationalists were hopeful that Imperial Germany's challenge to the great powers would liberate Iran from Anglo-Russian hegemony. In reality, however, further misfortunes prompted by the war brought the Iranian government to a standstill and the country to further disarray and misery. Iran was not even a party to a war that was fought violently over Europe's imperial ambitions, pride, and power games. So, as I've just said, Iran was not directly involved in this war at all, at least not initially. But to many Iranian nationalists, this war was seen as a good opportunity for national liberation. They had this conception that the imperialist infighting of Central Europe would give Iran more leverage. As the British and Russian Empire got weakened during the war, it would give Iran a better opportunity for liberation from colonization. This is actually why many Iranian nationalists had a strong support for the German Empire. They saw Germany as a destructive force that could interrupt the British and Russians, who were deeply colonizing and exploiting them. Unfortunately for the Iranians, this uneasy alliance with Germany did not end up serving them well. And in fact, it was their relation with Germany that initially had gotten Iran involved in World War I. Prior to World War I, Germany had established extensive commercial operations in Tabriz, including a large carpet factory named the Batag, and there was a large German colony in the city. Immediately after the outbreak of the war in Europe, the Russians had attempted to drive out the Germans from Tabriz and to seize German assets in Azerbaijan. On September 8, 1914, the Russian Consul General in Tabriz had requested the Iranian Governor-General of the province to arrest numerous German and Persian employees of the Batag and to send them to Russia. This was a violation of Iran's neutrality, but with 15,000 Russian troops in the vicinity, the hapless governor had no choice but to accede to the request. On September 10, 1914, the German consulate in Tabriz was attacked and a Russian had tried to assassinate the German consul in Tabriz. This was officially the first act of foreign aggression against Iran at the beginning of World War I, and it would get much worse from here on. Within the first 3 months of World War I, Iran got invaded by British, Russian, and Ottoman forces. This invasion and war completely devastated Iran. The government wasn't stable beforehand, so of course this war made everything much more chaotic and unstable. This is when we truly begin to see the start of the Great Iranian Famine. One of the first reports of the famine came from an American who was living in Tehran. In a report dated May 20, 1915, the American consul in Tehran, Ralph H. Bader, provides an overview of the food situation 9 months after the outbreak of the war in Europe and 6 months after the initial Anglo-Russian aggression against Iran. Bader describes the impact of the war on prices of imported and domestic products. Upon the breaking out of the hostilities in Europe, last August, importations into Persia practically ceased. Articles of foreign production have therefore greatly increased in price, while increases in price of articles produced locally have been slight. Among the articles of local production that have not increased in price are mutton, beef, Persian flour, chickens, eggs, and fruit. Rice, which is grown on the lowlands along the Caspian Sea, has increased in price from 5 cents to 6 cents. These rising food prices were very unfortunate, but it wasn't indicative of a major crisis, so most of the Iranian officials tried to ignore and downplay the situation. But as the war ravaged on with Russian and Anglo troops, it did not look like the situation was going to get better. All across Iran, people experienced hunger and more food scarcity. But 1916 would not be the worst of it. And in fact, things would get much worse in 1917 due to bad weather and drought. In an entry of April 19, 1917, Ain al-Sultanah writes, "This is a bad year. There was little rain in the winter, and now 28 days into the spring, there has not been a drop of rain. The streams are dry, and all grass in the fields and orchards has withered. The spring wheat and barley crop is practically lost. And Tokeban, only a third of the rice area has been cultivated. No one recalls such a dry season." This terrible weather, combined with the ongoing conflict and bad government response, would lead to thousands and thousands of deaths. This crisis became even more obvious as many people registered themselves destitute and impoverished. In the newspaper Rad, in the early days of the Persian New Year, March 21, 1917, an average of 520 persons had died per week as compared to the usual 300, an indication that 220 persons died of hunger per week. In an entry a few days later, Ain al-Sultanah writes, "Famine and hunger prevail in all parts of the country. Muslims and people of all faiths are dying. In Qom, currently 50 die each day. In Hamdan, 30,000 have registered as destitute. In Tehran, the reporter for Rad saw with his own eyes a group of old men and women who were taking a sheep. In Tehran, the reporter for Rad saw with his own eyes a group of old men and women who were taking sheep blood from the slaughterhouse to feed themselves and their children." The starvation was extremely brutal and began to kill large percentages of the population. And in addition to this brutal starvation, disease became widespread. In addition to famine, cholera extracted a terrible toll. Ain al-Sultanah reports that cholera, also known as death by diarrhea, had created terror among the people, high and low, and many had stopped eating fruit. He writes, "I read in the newspaper that it had killed 1 million people. If each 12 crowns that the government pays for the funeral of an unclaimed corpse had been initially spent on prevention, not so many would have died. Most families have spent so much on doctors and drugs that they are left with no furnishings, nor can they afford bread. They are destitute and now must beg." So as you can tell, the situation is extremely dire, and Iran is in basically collapse. This brutal famine would continue for some time, but with the end of World War I on the horizon, conditions would eventually get better. The Treaty of Versailles was officially signed on June 28, 1919, which would mark an end to the war. This would lead to a gradual improvement for the Iranian situation as imports and trade was able to continue at a more fast pace. Food prices would start to lower and go back to normal. In a quarterly report number 2, dated January 10, 1919, White indicates that conditions in Tehran were improving. Economic conditions in the capital have been much improved during the last quarter, in a great measure to the appointment of a Belgian as food controller. The price of bread, sangak, which is now plentiful, has been fixed at 3 krons a mon, which is low enough to allow the poor to buy sufficient for their needs. The next harvest was relatively generous, so the conditions of Iran did begin to improve, and the famine would eventually come to an end. But this is not the end of the story. In the next section, I'll be discussing perhaps the most controversial aspect, which is the actual death toll. The death toll is very much so debated amongst academics and historians. There's a lot of different sources I'm going to be going over, and this will be the final section, so I can finally give a conclusion to this event. Regarding this famine, the most well-known piece of academic literature is The Great Famine and Genocide in Iran by Mohammad Majd. I've already quoted from this book many times throughout the video, so I'll do this to wrap up the video. Now, he is of the opinion that the famine killed anywhere between 8 to 10 million people in Iran. A most remarkable fact about the Iranian famine of 1917 to 1919 is its relative magnitude. While the 1943 Indian famine had claimed 3 to 5 million out of a population of some 300 million, the Iranian famine in World War I had taken 8 to 10 million out of a population of 18 to 20 million. Now, with this number of 8 to 10 million, most academics don't actually agree because most of them are starting from a much lower initial population. One such example is Julian Barrère. In his 1968 article, Julian Barrère uses backward projection to estimate of Iran's population during 1900 to 1966. He first presents two population estimates for the period 1900 to 1966. So using this method of retroactively assuming growth rates and population size, Barrère has an estimation that the population of Iran was around 9 to 10 million before the famine. And from what I've looked at, most academics tend to agree with this number. Barrère then presents his own estimate, which he claims to be the nearest one can get to the truth. His estimate for 1900 is 9.86 million, that of 1910 is 10.66 million, that of 1914 is 10.89 million, and that of 1919 is 11.10 million. He employs the backward projection method, but he uses the adjusted figure for the 1965 census, 20.38 million. Now, Majd disagrees with this number a lot, and he actually thinks the initial number, the initial population of Iran, was much, much higher. And one of the ways he comes to this conclusion is by looking at the urban population. Gilbar estimates that the urban population of Iran increased from 850,000, 8 to 9% of total, in 1870 to 1.8 million, 18% of the total, in 1900, and the population of Tehran increased from 70,000 in 1870 to 250,000 in 1900. There's ample evidence that Iran's urban population had grown to at least 2.5 million by 1910. So Majd is basically asserting that the numbers that Barrère is giving does not line up at all with the urban population. Because if you use the numbers that he uses, that would mean that the urban population was over 25% of the population, which simply isn't possible. Given Iran's level of development, it is impossible to reconcile an urban population of at least 2.5 million with the estimates by Hodam, Schlender, Barrère, and Gilbar that the 1910 population of 10 million, because it would imply an urban population ratio of 25%. Majd uses his own calculation and comes to the conclusion that the population was actually around 20 million in 1914. Applying the urban population ratio of 12% to an urban population of 2.5 million, we obtain a population figure of 20 million, which, interestingly, is the figure given in two 1914 reports by the American minister to Iran given below. So, with a population of 20 million, he's then able to estimate that the death toll is actually around 8 to 10 million people, which is contrary to what the other people were saying. Now, there is still an academic debate around the exact population of Iran before the famine. Calculating an entire population before modern census data is obviously very difficult, and Majd is still in the minority when it comes to his estimation. But specifically, to go back to the estimation by Barrère, it doesn't seem that his source is very credible either. The current government of Iran has actually released a statement to critique his analysis. Barrère's work faces 4 scientific deficiencies. Barrère does not consider the loss of population caused by the famine in his calculation. He needs to adjust the figures of the official census in 1956 from 18.97 million to 20.37 million. And this is despite the fact that he uses 1956 census as his primary building block for his backward projection model. He also ignores the official growth rates and uses his personal assumptions in this regard, which is far lower than other estimates. Finally, although Barrère frequently cites Amani's estimates,
In the end, Bahrair's findings contradict that of Amani's. Notably, Bahrair's population estimate for 1911 is 12.19 million, while Amani puts his figure at 10.94 million.
So, as you can see, there's not exactly a clear consensus on the exact population of Iran. It's still a complicated debate. Now, I'm not an academic on Iran, so I can't speak authoritatively on who is correct. But from my reading, it does seem like Majd is probably closer to the truth. Now, as a conclusion for this video, I'm going to address whether or not this famine could constitute a genocide. As you might have noticed from the title of this book, Majd is firmly of the opinion that the famine of Iran was purposely constructed by British imperialists as an attempt to starve the Iranian population. I'll once again cite the Iranian government, which paraphrases the argument that Majd was making. It should be noted that Iran had been one of the main suppliers of food grains to the British forces stationed in the empire's South Asian colonies. Although bad harvest during these 2 years made the situation worse, it was by no means the main reason why the Great Famine occurred. Professor Gholi Majd of Princeton University writes in his book, The Great Famine and Genocide in Persia, that American documents show that the British prevented imports of wheat and other food grains into Iran from Mesopotamia, Asia, and also the USA, and that ships loaded with wheat were not allowed to unload at the port of Bushehr in the Persian Gulf. Professor Majd argues that Great Britain intentionally created genocide conditions to destroy Iran, and to effectively control the country for its own purposes. Major Donho describes Iran of that time as a land of desolation and death. This does seem to be like pretty clear evidence that the British Empire was explicitly complicit in the starvation of Iran. Now, the term genocide is a bit complicated here because genocide implies intent, and it's hard to say that this famine was planned in advance. But regardless, the British Empire does hold an immense amount of responsibility. And even more damning evidence is the fact that the British government purposely tried to hide their involvement that they had in the famine. They tried to hide documents that showed their culpability. The documents published by the British government overlooked the genocide, and consequently, the tragedy underwent an attempted cover-up by the British government. The Foreign Office Handbook of Iran of 1919 mentioned nothing related to the Great Famine. So, overall, regardless if you want to call it a genocide or not, the British Empire does have a lot of responsibility to hold for the Great Iranian Famine of 1914 to 1919, which is easily the largest famine in Middle Eastern history. With all of that said, thank you for watching, and I'll link more sources in the description if you want to do further reading. Please subscribe, and I hope to be more active in making videos in the future. Goodbye.